The year is 597 AD. A monk named Augustine steps onto the shores of Kent with 40 companions, carrying nothing but prayer books, a silver cross, and orders from the Pope himself. The Anglo-Saxon king watches from his fortress, suspicious of these strange men in their dark robes. He insists on meeting them outdoors in the open air because everyone knows that foreign sorcerers lose their power under the sky. The king's wife, however, secretly wears a Christian cross beneath her pagan gown. This moment would change Britain forever, but the story of how Christianity conquered these islands didn't begin here, and it certainly didn't end with simple conversion. What actually happened was far stranger, more violent, and more calculated than most people realize. Beneath nearly every church in England lies something older. Sometimes it's Roman stone. Sometimes it's the shadow of a sacred grove. And sometimes, if you know where to look, you can still see the faces of the old gods carved into the pillars of Christian cathedrals, their mouths frozen mid-scream as if protesting their own erasure. The replacement of paganism with Christianity in Britain wasn't a gentle transition of faith. It was a 1500-year struggle involving massacres, miracles, political marriages, rewritten histories, and one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns the ancient world had ever seen. And here's the twist that almost nobody talks about. Christianity didn't actually replace paganism. It absorbed it, repurposed it, and wore its skin so convincingly that even today, most of what we call Christian tradition in Britain has pagan roots we've simply forgotten. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind to Roman Britain before the legions left, before the Anglo-Saxons arrived, before Augustine ever set foot on those Kentish shores. In 313 AD, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity across the Roman Empire. Britain, a far-flung province covered in mist and mystery, had already been touched by the new faith. Christian symbols appear on Roman British artifacts as early as the 2nd century. A house church in Lullingstone, Kent, contains some of the earliest Christian wall paintings in Britain, showing worshippers with their arms raised in prayer. At Hinton St. Mary in Dorset, archaeologists discovered a mosaic floor featuring Christ's face behind the Chi symbol, the oldest known representation of Jesus in British art. These weren't missionaries converting barbarians. These were Roman citizens, living in villas with heated floors, practicing their faith quietly while their neighbors still poured wine for Jupiter and Mercury. But here's what's fascinating. Even these early British Christians hedged their bets. At the temple complex in Bath, dedicated to Sulis Minerva, a hybrid goddess blending Celtic and Roman identities, offerings continued well into the Christian period. People who probably attended church on Sunday still threw curse tablets into the sacred springs, asking the goddess to punish thieves and unfaithful lovers. The human mind is wonderfully contradictory. When your child is sick, you'll pray to any god who might listen. Then came 410 AD. Rome abandoned Britain. The legions withdrew, taking their administration, their economy, and their official Christianity with them. What happened next is one of history's great mysteries, a period so obscure we call it the Dark Ages. The cities emptied, the villas crumbled, and into this chaos came waves of Germanic invaders. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, all thoroughly pagan, worshipping Woden and Thuner, performing sacrifices in sacred groves, and bringing with them a worldview so different from Christianity that the two faiths seemed utterly incompatible. The Romano-British Christians didn't disappear, though. They retreated westward into Wales, Cornwall, and Ireland, where they developed their own unique form of Christianity, isolated from Rome, guided by wandering monks and holy men who lived in stone beehives on windswept islands. These Celtic Christians preserved literacy, copied manuscripts, and created illuminated gospels of breathtaking beauty. Meanwhile, in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms now dominating eastern Britain, paganism reigned supreme. Archaeological evidence from this period is chilling. At Sutton Hoo, the famous ship burial of an Anglo-Saxon king contains treasures from across the known world, but not a single Christian symbol. Bodies were cremated or buried with weapons, jewelry, and food for the afterlife. One burial at Sewerby contained a woman interred with an iron blade placed over her legs. perhaps to prevent her from walking after death. The two Britons existed side by side, Christian Celts in the west, pagan Anglo-Saxons in the east, and they hated each other. Not because of religion primarily, but because of war, displacement, and cultural annihilation. The Anglo-Saxons had taken everything. Why would the British Christians want to share their God with these invaders? This is where Pope Gregory the Great enters our story. In Rome, around 596 AD, Gregory allegedly saw fair-haired slave boys in the market. Told they were Angles, he made a pun that would echo through history. Non Angli sed angeli, he said. Not Angles, but angels. Whether this actually happened or was later propaganda doesn't matter. What matters is that Gregory decided the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms needed converting, and he sent Augustine to do it. Now, before you go, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you're getting value from Professor Archive and want to support deep dives like this, there's a super thanks button below. Even a small amount helps us keep making these documentary-length explorations of history. But no pressure, just having you here matters. Augustine's mission landed in Kent for specific strategic reasons. King Ethelbert of Kent was the most powerful ruler in southern England, and crucially, he was married to Bertha, a Frankish Christian princess. Her marriage contract stipulated she could continue practicing her faith, and she'd brought a Frankish bishop with her. This meant there was already a Christian foothold in Kent, already a church, St. Martin's, still standing in Canterbury today, where Bertha quietly prayed while her pagan husband ruled. Ethelbert's decision to meet Augustine outdoors wasn't paranoid superstition, it was political theater. By showing he feared potential magic, he demonstrated caution to his nobles while simultaneously signaling openness by granting the meeting at all. After hearing Augustine preach through interpreters, Ethelbert gave a response that reveals the pragmatic Anglo-Saxon mindset. Your words and promises are fair, but because they are new to us and uncertain, I cannot accept them and abandon the beliefs I have long held with the whole English people. But because you have come as strangers from far away and seem to wish to share with us things you believe to be true and good, we will not harm you. We will receive you hospitably and provide what you need, and we will not forbid you from winning people to your faith through preaching. This wasn't conversion, this was tolerance, the first step in a very long game. Ethelbert did eventually convert, probably influenced by Bertha, and probably calculating the political advantages. Alliance with Christian Francia, trading partnerships with Christian Europe, and the administrative benefits of literate clergy who could write laws and keep records. His baptism around 601 AD opened the floodgates. Thousands of his subjects converted on Christmas Day that year, not because of profound spiritual revelation, but because when a king changes gods, so do his people if they value their lives and livelihoods. But here's what Pope Gregory understood, and what made the Christian conversion of Britain ultimately successful. You don't erase the old gods, you repurpose them. In a letter to Mellitus, one of Augustine's companions, Gregory laid out a strategy of stunning sophistication. Don't destroy the pagan temples, he wrote. Destroy the idols, yes, but sprinkle the buildings with holy water and convert them into churches. Don't abolish the feast where animals are sacrificed. Instead, allow people to kill animals on Christian feast days and let them build shelters of branches around the churches, the same way they did at pagan festivals. Let them feast and celebrate, but dedicate it to Christian martyrs instead of demons. This was cultural warfare disguised as accommodation. Gregory understood that people don't abandon their sacred places or their traditions. If you want them to accept a new god, you have to let them worship him in familiar ways, in familiar locations. And it worked. All across England, churches rose on the sites of pagan temples. At Westminster Abbey, beneath the medieval foundations, there's evidence of a pagan sanctuary. At Knowlton in Dorset, a Norman church sits perfectly centered within a Neolithic henge, a stone circle thousands of years older than Christianity. The message was clear. This place has always been holy. We're just giving you the correct understanding of why. The saints replaced the gods with barely a name change. Saint Bridget absorbed the Celtic goddess Brigid. Holy wells dedicated to nameless water spirits became shrines to Saint Winifred or Saint Anne. The old festival of Samhain, when the boundary between worlds grew thin, became All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day. The winter solstice celebration, when people brought evergreen boughs indoors to symbolize life's persistence through darkness, became Christmas, even though Christ was almost certainly born in spring. Easter, even the name comes from Eostre, the Anglo-Saxon goddess of spring and dawn. But conversion wasn't universally peaceful or unanimous. In Northumbria, the story took a darker turn. King Edwin converted in 627 AD after his pagan high priest Coifi had an existential crisis. According to Bede, writing a century later, Coifi told the council, "I have long realized that our religion is worthless, for the more diligently I sought the truth in our cult, the less I found it. Now I confess openly that the truth shines out clearly in this teaching. I advise that we should instantly abandon and destroy by fire the temples and altars that we have held sacred without reaping any benefit." Then, in a moment of shocking symbolism, Coifi rode Edwin's stallion, which as a pagan priest he was forbidden to do, carried a spear and weapons also forbidden to him, and hurled the spear into the temple of the gods at Goodmanham. The building was burned to the ground. Thousands converted. But when Edwin died in battle a few years later, Northumbria immediately reverted to paganism. Edwin's widow fled with the Christian missionary Paulinus. Chaos reigned. Christianity had failed. Until King Oswald came to power and invited Irish missionaries from Iona to re-evangelize Northumbria. St. Aidan and his monks succeeded where Roman missionaries had failed, living simply, speaking the language, walking the roads, embodying humility rather than authority. The Christianity they taught was gentler, more mystical, tied to nature and Celtic tradition. It spread like wildfire. But now there were two Christianities in Britain. The Roman version from Canterbury, dating Easter by Roman calculation, with Roman tonsure and Roman authority, and the Celtic version from Ireland and Wales, dating Easter differently, cutting their monks' hair differently, and acknowledging the Pope but not submitting to Rome's micromanagement. In 664 AD, at the Synod of Whitby, King Oswiu of Northumbria had to choose. The debate was ostensibly about Easter dating and tonsures, but really it was about identity. Would Britain be Roman or Celtic? Oswiu chose Rome. The Roman party argued that Peter held the keys to heaven, and Rome was Peter's church. Oswiu reportedly said, "Then I shall not contradict the doorkeeper, lest when I come to the gates of heaven there be no one to open them." It might have been theology, or it might have been politics, keeping England connected to the powerful continental church. Either way, Roman Christianity won, and Celtic Christianity gradually faded into the mists of the Western Islands, leaving behind stone crosses, illuminated manuscripts, and legends of saints who tamed dragons and spoke to animals. Even after official conversion, paganism didn't die. It went underground, literally and figuratively. In rural areas, people still left offerings at sacred springs. They still performed rituals to ensure good harvests. They still believed in elves and dwarves and land spirits. The church didn't stamp these out. It couldn't. Instead, it rebranded them. The elves became demons or fairy folk, existing in a gray area of Christian cosmology. The charms and spells for healing or protection were rewritten to include Christian prayers and saints' names. There's an Anglo-Saxon charm for curing a sudden stitch, a stabbing pain, which blames it on elf shot, invisible arrows fired by malicious spirits, and the cure involves Christian prayer, herbal remedies, and a bizarre ritual with a knife. Paganism and Christianity blended into something neither Rome nor Woden would recognize. What profession are you in, by the way? I ask because I'm always curious who's drawn to these historical deep dives. Historians and students, obviously, but also nurses, engineers, people working night shifts and listening while they work. History connects all of us. Let me know in the comments. The final eradication of open paganism took centuries and involved violence we rarely discuss. When Christian kings consolidated power, Pagan holdouts were dealt with harshly. Laws demanded attendance at church. Pagan practices were criminalized. In 686 AD, King Cadwalla of Wessex invaded the Isle of Wight, the last pagan Anglo-Saxon kingdom, slaughtered the population, and forcibly baptized the survivors. The king and his brother were killed. Genocide wrapped in conversion. This wasn't evangelism, it was conquest, and the cross was planted in blood-soaked soil. The Vikings, arriving in 793 with the sacking of Lindisfarne, brought paganism roaring back. For 2 centuries, Danish and Norwegian pagans carved out kingdoms in Britain, erected altars to Thor, and mocked the Christian God who seemed powerless to stop their axes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the despair. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. But even the Vikings eventually converted, sometimes through genuine faith, more often through political calculation. When Guthrum, the Danish king, was baptized in 878 as part of his peace treaty with Alfred the Great, it was transactional. Alfred stood as his godfather, and Guthrum gained legitimacy and alliance. His warriors still wore Thor's hammers alongside their new crosses. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, England was thoroughly, officially Christian. Every village had a church. Tithes funded an elaborate ecclesiastical hierarchy. Monasteries controlled vast estates. But scratch the surface, and paganism's skeleton remained visible beneath Christianity's skin. The May Day celebrations with their phallic maypoles and flower crowns had nothing to do with Jesus. The Yule log, the holly and ivy, the wassailing of apple trees, all pagan, all absorbed into Christian calendar without acknowledgement. The church bells that rang to ward off storms, that's magic, not theology. The belief that certain saints protect against specific ailments, that's the old system of specialized gods wearing new names. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Christianity didn't defeat paganism in Britain. It assimilated it so completely that most modern Christians performing pagan rituals don't even realize it. When you knock on wood for luck, you're touching a sacred tree. When you throw salt over your shoulder, you're performing an apotropaic ritual older than Scripture. When you celebrate Christmas with evergreen trees and mistletoe, you're acknowledging winter solstice traditions that predate Christianity by millennia. The sacred places reveal this most clearly. At Knowlton Church, abandoned now, standing ruined within that prehistoric henge, you can see the strategy laid bare. The Christians didn't choose that spot randomly. They built there because it was already holy, already humming with power that drew people across generations. By placing a church there, they claimed that power, redirected it, told people, what you felt here was real, but you misunderstood its source. It wasn't the old gods. It was always our God. You just didn't know his name. In Cornwall, holy wells still receive offerings, ribbons and coins, prayers for healing. Technically, they're dedicated to Christian saints, but the practice, the belief that water from certain springs holds special power, that's older than Rome, older than writing. At Madron Well, people tie strips of cloth to nearby trees and push pins into the bark, sympathetic magic to transfer illness from body to tree. The church tolerates it because calling it veneration of St. Madron makes it acceptable, barely. The Anglo-Saxon poem, The Dream of the Rood, shows the synthesis perfectly. It's Christian, telling the crucifixion from the perspective of the cross itself, but the imagery is pure pagan warrior culture. Christ doesn't suffer passively. He's a young hero, stripping himself for battle, embracing the cross like a warrior, embracing glorious death. The cross itself speaks like a thane, a loyal retainer covered in treasure and blood, honored for its service. This wasn't the Christ of Mediterranean theology. This was Christ remade for Anglo-Saxon warriors who understood courage, loyalty, and the glory of dying well. And the missionaries knew exactly what they were doing. When St. Boniface, an English missionary to the Germanic tribes, chopped down Thor's oak at Geismar in 723 AD, he was staging theater. He dared the god to strike him down. When nothing happened, when Thor's lightning didn't come, the assembled pagans saw divine impotence. Boniface used the oak's wood to build a chapel dedicated to St. Peter. The message, "Your gods are dead or never existed," and mine has claimed their sacred places as spoils of war. But paganism had the last laugh in a sense. It survived in folklore, in fairy tales, and the unexamined assumptions of rural life. When medieval peasants left out milk for the household spirits, that wasn't Christian. When they refused to plow certain fields because the fairies lived there, that wasn't church teaching. When they performed rituals on Midsummer's Eve or Lammas, weaving wheat into corn dollies and jumping over fires, they were maintaining traditions their ancestors performed 1,000 years earlier before any missionary set foot in Britain. The witch trials of the early modern period were, in a twisted way, the church's admission that paganism never truly died. If Christianity had completely won, there'd be no witches to hunt. But people still knew the charms. They still consulted cunning folk for love spells and curses. They still believed in a magical world where the right words, the right rituals, could bend reality. The church called it witchcraft and Satanism, but often it was just the remnants of pre-Christian practice. Grandmother wisdom about herbs and stars and the power in certain words spoken at certain times. By the time we reached the Reformation, Christianity in Britain had become something unique, a faith layered over centuries of belief like sediment-forming rock. Henry VIII's break with Rome in 1534 was political, not theological initially, but it triggered upheaval that exposed these layers. Monasteries dissolved, saints' shrines destroyed, pilgrimages forbidden, and suddenly people realized how much of their Christianity was actually local tradition, with a thin Christian veneer. Some parishes hid their saint statues, hoping to restore them later. Others burned them enthusiastically, Protestant reformers who saw Catholic practice as barely disguised paganism, which, to be fair, it often was. The Puritans went further, trying to strip Christianity back to biblical essentials. They banned Christmas, calling it popish and pagan. They forbade maypoles, Morris dancing, and church ales. They wanted pure faith, unmarked by tradition or superstition. And they failed utterly because you cannot legislate away practices woven into the rhythm of agricultural life, into the cycle of seasons, into the deep human need for celebration, magic, and mystery. When the Puritans lost power, everything they'd banned came roaring back, precisely because it wasn't really Christian to begin with. It was British, older and deeper than any doctrine. Today, if you know where to look, pagan Britain still exists. At Stonehenge during summer solstice, modern Druids gather, a tradition invented in the 18th century but claiming ancient lineage. In Glastonbury, neo-pagans and Christians coexist uneasily, both claiming the land's spiritual power. At Haytor on Dartmoor, people still see lights they call pixies. In the Scottish Highlands, offerings appear at Clootie wells, rags tied to branches in patterns identical to those from 1,000 years ago. The Church of England's calendar is a pagan skeleton dressed in Christian vestments. Harvest Festival, Rogation-tide processions blessing the fields, Plough Monday, Candlemas, none of these are biblical. They're agricultural, tied to planting and reaping, to the sun's journey and the earth's fertility. Even the architecture tells the story. Green men, pagan fertility figures with faces made of leaves, are carved into hundreds of medieval churches. At Rosslyn Chapel, they're everywhere, grinning from pillars and arches, utterly unchristian yet utterly integrated. So did Christianity replace paganism in Britain? In one sense, absolutely. By 700 AD, you couldn't openly worship Woden or Thunor without facing execution. The temples were destroyed, the priests converted or killed, the myths forgotten or demonized. Christianity won the institutional, political, and cultural battle decisively. But in another sense, paganism never left. It simply changed form, surrendered its gods but kept its holy places, its festivals, its understanding of the world as enchanted and alive with unseen powers. Christianity didn't replace paganism so much as it created a hybrid faith, uniquely British, that acknowledged one God in heaven while quietly honoring the spirits in the well, the luck in the horseshoe, the power in the old stones. This is Professor Archive, and if this exploration opened your eyes to the hidden layers beneath familiar traditions, let me know in the comments. Hit that like button if you want more deep dives into the strange, forgotten corners of history. And remember, Every time you see a church built on a hilltop, pause and wonder, what was here first? What did people worship before the cross arrived? The answers are there, carved in stone, whispered in place names, hiding in plain sight in traditions we perform without questioning. History isn't dead and buried, it's alive, layered, and far stranger than we usually admit. Thanks for watching.